Welcome. Today is 7 for day 7, radicals with equations. So let's just have a quick review moment. So when we solved equations way back in the beginning of algebra, for example, equation 6x plus 5 equals negative 13, our first step is we were trying to work to get x by itself. So the first thing we would do is we'd subtract 5 on both sides, leaving us with 6x equals negative 18. And then we divide by 6 on both sides, leaving us with x equals negative 3. Now today what we're going to work on is we're going to work on equations that have radicals in them, and how do we solve those equations. So our first step is to get the radical, the whole entire radical. Sometimes there's a variable, sometimes there's a constant and a variable. We want to get that alone. Once it's alone, we square both sides of the equation. Then, once we square both sides, we don't have a radical anymore. We just solve the equation that remains, just like we would normally solve an equation. Okay, let's put this into practice. So, let's see. Radical 5x equals 10. Well, first step, get the radical alone. The radical is already alone. 5x is in the radical, but only the radicals on this side. So then I can square both sides. Now when I square both sides, it's important, I like to put parentheses down so I don't forget that you're squaring everything on each side. And this becomes more helpful as we get into more complicated problems. So the square and the radical cancel out, so I'm just left with 5x on this side. So remember, that's very important. The square of a radical cancels out. When you square a radical, it cancels out. So 5x on that left side equals, well, 10 squared is 100. Now I solve this equation just like I normally would solve any other equation. Get x by itself, so I'm going to divide by 5 on both sides. I'm left with x equals 20. And there's my final answer. Okay, let's try another one. Let's see, 2 times radical of 5x equals 30. First step, get the radical alone. Right now it's not alone. This 2 is in the way of it being alone, so I'm going to get rid of that 2 by dividing by 2. Remember, it's a 2 times radical 5x, that's why I'm dividing. So let's see, on the left side I'm just left with radical 5x. On the right side, I'm left with 15. Well, now my radical is alone, so that's now when I can square it. So I'm going to square my 5x. I'm going to square my 15. Well, my square and my radical cancel out, so I'm left with 5x on the left side equals, let's see, 15x is 225. Again, this is just now a normal equation. We know how to solve this. Get x by itself. I'm going to divide by 5. Divide by 5. I'm left with x equals 45 as my final answer. Okay, 5 plus radical x equals 9. Well, again, step 1, get the radical by itself. This 5 plus is in the way of the radical b by itself, so I'm going to get rid of it by subtracting 5 on both sides. So on my left side, I'm left with radical x. On my right side, 9 minus 5 is 4. I'm going to get rid of that radical by squaring both sides. Radical x squared is just an x. 4 squared is 16. X equals 16 is my final answer. Okay, radical 2j minus 4 equals 8. Step 1, I'm going to get that radical by itself. So that minus 4 is in the way of the radical b by itself, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I'm left with the radical 2j equals 12. Since my radical is all alone, now I'm going to square both sides. So here I'm left with 2j equals 12 squared is 144. Let's see, now I need to solve for j, get j by itself, and divide by 2, divide by 2. I'm left with j equals 72. And there's my final answer. Let's see, 2 plus 3 radical y equals 13. I need to get the radical by itself, so the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this 2 right here. I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I'm left with 3 radical y equals, 11. I'm going to divide by 3 on both sides. So I'm left with radical y equals 11 thirds. I can't simplify this fraction. Next, since my radical is alone, I'm going to square both sides of the equation. So I'm left with y equals, and now this is where it's important to remember that when I'm squaring everything. So that's why I like to draw things in parentheses. I'm squaring both the 11 and the third. So that's the same as 11 squared, which is 121, over 3 squared, which is 9. So y is equal to 121 ninths. Okay. For radical of x minus 5 equals 15. Again, first step. First step, 4 times radical x minus 5 equals 15. First step is I need to get that radical by itself, so I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides. So I'm left with a radical x minus 5 is equal to 15 fourths. Can't reduce that fraction at all. Next, I'm going to square both sides. I'm going to add in some parentheses, so I remember to square everything on each of the sides. So on my left side, I'm just left with an x minus 5, and that is equal to, well, 15 squared is 225. 4 squared is 16. Let's see, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to tell you right now that 225 over 16 is 14 and 1/16 as a mixed number. But you could also take the time and divide and actually figure out that that is what that mixed number is. Next, I'm going to add 5 to both sides. To get x by itself, I'm left with x equals 19 and 1/16. That's my final answer. Okay, next step, we are now going to solve equations when there are 2 radicals. So not just one, but 2 of them. So our first step is we're going to square both sides of the equation and then solve the equation that remains. So let's see this in action. Okay. 4 radical 7 equals radical negative m. First step, I'm going to square both sides. Now this is where it gets really, really important that we start putting in parentheses before we square. Oops, there we go. So you remember to square everything. This side, 4 square root of 7, you're not just squaring that square root, you're also squaring that 4. So one thing you can do is you can rewrite this as 4 root 7 times 4 root 7. That is 16 root 49, or 16 times 7, and that should equal, well, negative m squared, or root radical negative m squared. That just cancels out the radical, so I'm left with a negative n. Well, 16 times 7, that's 112, and that's equal to negative m. Let's see, I want to get m all by itself, so I need to multiply by -1 on both sides to get rid of that negative sign. Or I could also divide by -1 as well. So I'm left with -112 equals m as my final answer. Okay, now we're going to do another example. So step 1, I'm going to square both sides of the equation. Whoops. So I'm going to square this side. I'm going to put in parentheses around this side so I remember to square both the 4 and the radical 3. Well, radical m minus 5 squared is just m minus 5. That radical cancels out. Would equal 4 radical 3 squared. That's the same as doing 4 radical 3 times 4 radical 3. Let's see. That's the same as 16 times radical 9, which is 16 times 3. And that again is m minus 5. Well, let's see. 16 times 3 is 48. So we have 48 equals m minus 5. Last step, just solving this equation, adding 5 to both sides to get m by itself. So I'm left with m equals 53 as my final answer. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for watching this video on solving equations that involve radicals.